matters. Of course it does. Hi, I'm Debbie Moraes, your host and moderator. This program has been created, as we tell you, to educate, inform, and help you with law matters because the law matters. Understand the law better, and you're in a better position to decide how to protect yourself, your family, and your business. We continue to provide information and resources that will help you decide whether, in fact, you might want to handle some issues yourself. Perhaps you may decide that you do want to contact a lawyer. If you do need outside professional counsel, our hope is that you'll be better prepared, and so will the counsel you select. Either way, our goal, of course, is to help you achieve the best possible results while saving time and money. We welcome and thank Attorney David Bazar once again from the Bazar and Associates law firm in East Providence. He continues to provide us information and insights in each session. So today, the enlisted use of the First Amendment has led to some new and very contentious issues on college campuses, in your neighborhood pharmacy, in using your credit card, if you happen to be involved with union disputes. And even it's impacting on the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms, which we'll discuss. Open carry is a very symbolic speech issue. So we'll touch on some of these examples. So David, a quick primer. We've talked about First Amendment before, and without getting into the weeds of it, what's the First Amendment about?
Well, do we have a clock on the show today? Because there's a lot of stuff that we could cover, and I just want to make sure we have enough time to do it.
Okay.
So the First Amendment, obviously, is one of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which were passed at the time the Constitution was adopted. The first one is specifically talking about freedom of religion, free speech, a free press, those types of things.
So the First Amendment, particularly when it comes to free speech, has become a very big issue these days. They're saying on college campuses it's misunderstood by students, it's become weaponized, and it's politicized to either justify hate speech or to stifle speech. Sometimes it's considered to be just a political cover, and it's aimed to harass people, especially vulnerable groups or whatever. So when we talk about free speech, the element that we've addressed in the past is you have a right to speak freely, except you don't have the right to incite a riot,
right,
which has been going on in various college campuses, et cetera.
There are limits. And the famous story that the justices would always give is that you can't go into the crowded movie theater and yell fire. It's safety issues. So there's a balancing act between what is free speech and what you can do versus when does it infringe on other people's rights and safety. So
since when have we come from the right to speak freely to now you're just offending me? And don't I have the right to be offended, and why should I be protected from being offended by speech?
Yeah, the simple being offended by something someone is saying doesn't give grounds to infringe on the person's right to speak or to be offensive. And the example I think of goes back to Skokie, Illinois, I think it was, where the Jewish attorney defended the right of the Nazis to march in Skokie, Illinois. And the thing that was raised with him is, well, how can you do that? And his response was basically, how can I not do that? Because if we infringe speech and the people's right to assemble and speak for views that I totally disagree with, what's to stop someone from stopping people from speaking when I agree with what they're saying, if it's something that offends somebody else?
Exactly, which brings or underscores the very thing that's been in the news relative to college campuses today, where when you think that that's an ideal environment to foment debate and have discussions, but instead there are issues about perhaps a guest speaker. Should that guest speaker be allowed to come to campus when in fact I'm going to be offended? Whether he has a provocative view, a controversial view, a religious view, a moral issue to take exception with, yet college campuses are putting the kibosh on these guest speakers. Should they? Just don't attend if you don't want to see that.
That's what you would think. And I think part of it can be equated to the tone of politics in the country and people being very hurt and upset by how that is being handled by politicians and the divisiveness of it, you can have different opinions, and you can have you can have an opinion that if someone's coming that is so offensive to you that you either don't want to even listen to them or go or attend, or you want to protest peacefully, but in such a way that it doesn't interfere with the right of that person to make their offensive thoughts known, then that's what it should be all about. Colleges, I think, should be encouraging an exchange of ideas, even where they are offensive to maybe the majority of people. But hear somebody out, debate them. If you can have a free exchange of thoughts and ideas, encourage that. But do it in a way that's not going to interfere with the exchange of ideas.
And yet on so many occasions now you're hearing that that person is going to be inciting a riot. Well, why should that be necessary or implied as necessary and as grounds to ban the person from speaking?
Yeah, I mean, that says as much about the people who are offended by it as it does about the person who is offensive. There are a lot of people out there who have really radical, crazy thoughts and ideas. And I think it's more effective to debate them than to try to shut them up.
Makes sense. I mean, whether you're intimidating or insulting, it's not nice, but that's part of freedom of speech too, is it not? So of late, have you found that people have come to you as a lawyer and wanted to either kibosh somebody else's right to say something or do something in the name of free speech? There seem to be so many examples here now.
Yeah, that's not something in my practice that would come up very often. In fact, constitutional issues can come up, but they would be more limited to my civil rights were violated, not so much my right to free speech. Maybe if someone from a college came to me and said that this is something I want to fight for and it's not being allowed, it could come up, but it's not something in my practice I would see too often.
Yet they say that many lawyers now are having new cases come to them, whether someone's being censored or there are protests and there are some actions that have taken place as a result of it that shouldn't have. Is there any occasion that you could defend censorship?
Well, not.
Does
I
that
couldn't.
work?
Yeah. See, censorship in the sense that, let's just think about this. There is, in some instances,
okay.
And what I'm thinking about is social media and the whole issue with Facebook, I guess it was, where there were alleged hacking and bots or whatever all that stuff is, which is well beyond my knowledge base. But things that are being put out there that are interfering with elections and that type of thing. And so when Facebook or whatever the social media is takes those down, people could cry and claim censorship because it's taking something down. But I think it's a question of who's making the speech, and is it really somebody whose right to do that is protected under the First Amendment? So if it's somebody hacking in and using all of these fake things to create whatever it is that they're putting out there, and it's taken down, it's probably not someone who is protected under the Constitution to have right to free speech in the United States.
Right, the right, that's challenging the right to have the account because they're hacking in, versus obviously fake news is being challenged all the time now, and if nothing else, if you were an educator, you might be saying, I think it makes sense that you should do some fact checking because I'm going to say your red tie is blue, and someone might need to check that out and verify that it is or it isn't, but certainly you can say that someone has the right to say that. Now, when they talk about weaponized speech, the SCOTUS, the Supreme Court, says not necessarily is weaponized speech a bad thing. What might you say to that, David?
I guess I would have to ask them how they define weaponized speech.
How about if they said it was to protect yourself against the government, which is, for example, someone is using weaponized speech if they were protesting the Vietnam War. They have a right to protest, that's a different issue.
Right.
But they have a right to say very bad things about why they don't want to be in Vietnam or why they don't want to go to serve or whatever. But they have that as a right, and that they're saying that that might be weaponized speech. That's an act against the government. Is that necessarily a bad thing?
Not necessarily. I mean, I guess if you want to go back to Vietnam and the Supreme Court wants to define burning a draft card or the American flag as weaponized speech, then that should be protected under the First Amendment of someone who's protesting what the government is doing in a way that's not going to harm anybody else. So that should be protected. But if it's weaponized speech where it's inciting potential violence or that type of thing, that's where you might be getting close to being over the line.
So you don't want to cross the line in terms of inciting a riot for certain, sure. But I think a while ago we talked about someone writing graffiti under a bridge, and it was anti-Semitic or something. It was definitely hate speech. Is that against free speech?
Well, you know,
is that First Amendment protected?
There is a definition in the law and statutes on hate crime. And so there's a reason for that, and it's deep-seated racism and bigotry in the United States that we have, as a country, decided that that steps over the line. And so if you do something that steps over the line, your right to do it can be limited.
So that might not only offend me, but it might be hurtful in a way that someone doesn't have a right to post that or say that or protected.
I think there's a difference between free speech, and I'll go back to the example of the Nazi march or parade in Skokie, Illinois, which people can just turn their backs and walk away from, and they're desecrating by putting Nazi symbols on a temple or other places where they have stepped over the line.
Okay. How about the right of free speech when it comes to, we don't really need to tell you how much we're going to charge you, but if you decide to use your credit card, we have the right to charge you more. How does that get involved with free speech? Well, now they're, apparently how they say or how they explain it is a matter of a debate and whether or not it's accepted. And even our local government has to watch, but has the right apparently to say, if you pay your real estate taxes, David, with a credit card, we don't need to take that discount that we might ordinarily. We could charge you more for a surcharge. How does the average person get into the weeds and deal with something like that being a First Amendment issue?
Yeah, tell me how that's a First Amendment issue.
I don't know. They say that that's, it's not a matter of marketing, but it is a matter of how you will present a single-payer price for something. And if you hadn't disclosed it and how you disclose it may be an issue of First Amendment. I'm not sure that...
Yeah, I cannot follow that logic and determine how, if the state of Rhode Island charges a service charge or a fee, a convenience fee for registering your car online with a credit card, how that violates your free speech rights. I don't see it. I'll tell you what aggravates me more, and it has nothing to do with free speech. It's when the state will charge a tax on a tax, and you say, well, what are you talking about? Okay. So if I lease a car, and then the lease company sends me a bill for the property tax on the car, they then charge me a sales tax on the property tax. That doesn't make any sense to me.
That's not First Amendment, but it's certainly not
it's just
appropriate.
You would think it's not, but apparently under Rhode Island law at least, the state says, oh, well, that's a sale. What are you selling me? My tax? You're selling me your tax bill? I'm not sure exactly what I'm buying and what I'm getting for it.
So in that kind of example, you're really in the weeds when you have to decipher that, as with this other example that's pretty esoteric and strange. Now, the First Amendment, as it impacts on the Second Amendment, was kind of interesting.
I think my first one, though, That'd be a better equal protection argument.
Okay.
Because if I own my car and you get billed property tax, you pay the property tax.
Yes.
But if I lease my car, you're treating me differently because I'm paying the property tax and then I'm paying a sales tax on the property tax. So you're not treating me the same. So maybe there's an equal protection argument for that.
Well, I think that they get into that situation too when it comes to, I guess it was the state of Vermont had taken issue with whether or not the pharmaceutical manufacturer approached the pharmacies and tried to say that we can give you some details that will direct how and what you're going to sell to your, whether it's a consumer or whoever else, and we're going to be able to sell that information to data miners. And is that a freedom of is that a protection issue, or is it really a matter of not being able to share that information because it's really economic regulation and consumer protection?
It could be a privacy issue.
HIPAA or consumer?
Yeah, depending on what the information is that they're sharing, that's your information, there could be a privacy issue.
If you were a teacher and trying to explain to students these days how First Amendment works, and yet they're experiencing these kinds of things, whether it's at the hands of their pharmacy or if they're leasing a car, how do you help weed them through the weeds of this? Because it seems to have become an issue on so many different levels.
So I couldn't begin to explain to a student how a pharmacy issue has something to do with the First Amendment. But it's certainly an easy explanation to give some of the examples we talked about at the beginning as to what the Constitution is protecting. And remember, the Constitution, when it was formed and what it does throughout the years, is to protect individual rights. And the Supreme Court has consistently always looked at the Constitution and found individual rights that may not have even had been thought of at the time it was formed, but found a way to protect rights. It's usually more of an expansive look at how do we protect people's rights, because when the United States was fighting England for its freedom in the Revolutionary War, there was a king. And the king, had all the rights, and the people were his servants or subjects. And we did away with that type of government, and the Constitution was designed to create a way of protecting the individual rights. And that's why the 10th Amendment says that any rights not specifically delegated to the United States are reserved to the states or the people. It's really trying to make sure that all the rights that flow to the government come from the people.
So right now there are so many more economic regulations. When I've read how the Supreme Court has become involved, as they talk about, we have the right to challenge these issues that are being brought up because the government might be exercising or overreaching or not or whatever. But in terms of your right to say something, they're tending to counterbalance, I guess, the economic overreach or whatever you want to call it, or oversight.
Yeah. So that's been a balance back and forth for forever meaning since the United States was formed, about what is the role of government to protect people versus free economic expansion and reign. And the Commerce Clause has come into play to be used a lot of where one state might try to restrict things and affect commerce between that and another state. And then, of course, state government and all the regulations that can be imposed at that level. Where is it interfering with the right to economic prosperity and freedom versus protecting people in society?
How about with the unions, for example? There was an issue, I guess it was in Illinois, if I'm not mistaken, where there were people who just didn't want to join the union but were then forced to pay union dues. That became a contentious issue, and it was on the basis of First Amendment. I shouldn't have to pay to subsidize private free speech of what's being so clearly even in that situation the Supreme Court got involved, saying it's true, you shouldn't have to be paying for something that you are not subscribing to.
Right. Yeah, so that case, which was fairly recent, sort of used that issue in the law, in the Constitution, to say whether or not someone can be required to pay dues as a member of a union, which was sort of another way at it, because, you know, we've had lots of cases about whether or not someone can be compelled to be a member of a union or not to be a member of a union. So that was a very interesting use of the Constitution in that case. And
another example, so back to the example about the First Amendment and it impacting on the Second Amendment, didn't seem like there was a connection, except that apparently now the right to open carry is a symbolic speech. Yeah. So do you want to comment on that? Yeah. It's a rather interesting issue.
I guess the argument that would be made is I'm exercising my right to free speech by carrying my gun, and I should be allowed to carry my gun, and whatever the rules or regulations are to have a carry permit or open carry or that type of thing should be subject to my First Amendment right to do that. And of course, the First Amendment right to free speech, as we already talked about, can be limited. So certainly the Second Amendment right to bear arms can be limited. And it's really a balancing of your individual rights versus the right of society to be safe and free of harm.
And isn't that also an issue, too, about various states? Because some states have open carry issues and others absolutely say thou shalt not. And sometimes there's even an issue about there's open carry, but you can't open carry in a school or in a mall or some other specific places.
Right.
But when someone is saying, I have the right to open carry, that is symbolic speech. It's also educational. It's my right to educate the rest of the world that we have a right to carry, expose it, and I am broadcasting it. This is my banner. This is my poster. Comment on that. It seems like things are getting so stretched. And
yeah, it's a stretch because I'm sitting here thinking of your right to, you said, expose the gun. Well,
yes,
where does that exposure limit end? You know, when is it free speech and when is it offensive to other people to the effect that it's impacting them and should be limited?
It's not inciting a riot. It is symbolic, I guess. I'm telling you, this is my right, and I'm going to put that very, maybe hostilely, maybe not. But as more people are trying to push these limits, it looks like maybe lawyers, maybe the Supreme Court is going to end up with many more cases like this. I would never imagine that this First Amendment would have impacted so on the Second.
Yeah. Some of it makes sense, but some of it's a stretch.
So will that go back now, no matter what the Supreme Court says, will that ultimately go back to the states to rediscuss what their position is on firearms anyway?
Well, I think what the mechanism is, if the state has a law against carrying an exposed weapon, so to speak, then the person challenging it is bringing it to the courts and then eventually the Supreme Court. And then depending on what the Supreme Court rules, which is either A, that law violates the person's constitutional right, or it doesn't, that's when it would go back to the state. If it's unconstitutional, the law struck down.
Okay. What about the issues about pregnancies now? So there are some states that have very strong or political issues too, have strong feelings about when we and how much we can share with a person who is interested in having an abortion. Yes, there's an abortion situation, but at what point does the state or the Supreme Court get involved with a doctor's right and obligation to share with his patient what her options are, what the medical facts are? How can that be even questioned as a matter of free speech?
So again, I have to follow what you're trying to say, but if you're saying, can a law abridge the doctor's right to give advice to his patient? I'd have to know more about what you're saying.
Is there ever an occasion when a doctor should be prevented from disclosing all information to a patient? He could say, well, I'm against abortion personally, so I'm not going to tell them about that. Can that ever happen?
I think if what the patient is asking the doctor for in that state is legal, then the doctor can't do his job if his own thoughts or beliefs interfere with his ability to properly explain things to his patient.
Which has become an issue in some states. Now, they have had issues such as
So
that.
there are laws that go the opposite way that I've heard of, where the law requires the doctor to tell a patient certain things about abortion and the viability of a fetus and what they need to know about what they're doing. And it's really designed to try to, give somebody a second thought about whether they want to go through with that kind of thing.
Certainly.
And so that's different than stopping a doctor from explaining things fully. And I can see where someone might have an issue with requiring the doctor to tell certain things that the patient doesn't want to know.
Yes, how about that?
Well, that's different, and I can see where there could be a concern about that. If the law is passed in the state, it's got to go through the same test. If the patient wants to challenge it and bring it up and then eventually end up in the Supreme Court can rule whether or not the state is violating anybody's rights under the Constitution by requiring the doctor to do that. But to stop the doctor from doing that, I don't see how it constitutionally, a law would ever pass muster that says a doctor cannot give a patient the full explanation of everything that the patient wants to know.
And then on the other side of it, how about an institution, a hospital, that is saying no to the woman who wants an abortion, no until you sit down and get this much counseling, this much information, actually, and until we do that, we can't, and we choose not to perform an abortion. Is that an interruption of free speech, or is that another issue entirely that's not related to free speech?
I think it's another, that could actually, what you're explaining sounds to me more like a hospital that might be a Catholic hospital, for example, or under the auspices, and it's a religious issue, and they don't want to do it at all. And can you require a hospital to do something that's allowed under the law? And I'm not 100% sure what the rules are on that. But I can certainly see where if they're going to do it and the law allows it, that you have to follow whatever the rules of the state are in what you need to do in order to have that procedure performed at your place of work.
Well, we certainly have covered quite a few different topics. It's amazing how that First Amendment and speech, whether it's educational or offensive, has impacted so much of our lives. Thank you for staying tuned to The Law Matters. We wish you still to continue to stay tuned to The Law Matters because it matters to you.